Chris Pratt is no stranger to the spotlight. From his humble beginnings as a goofy, lovable actor on Parks and Recreation to becoming one of Hollywood's biggest stars, he's always been an open book, letting fans into his life through social media and interviews. But beyond the glitz and glamour, there's one aspect of Chris's life that often gets less attention, even though it's one of the most significant parts of who he is, his faith. Pratt has always been open about his Christianity, his beliefs guiding much of his personal and professional decisions. This, however, has made him a target for some. One day, while attending a press event for an upcoming blockbuster, Pratt found himself the subject of a pointed question from a liberal reporter. This wasn't the usual, "What's it like working with this amazing cast?" type of inquiry. No, this reporter wanted to address something far more personal. With a casual tone that belied the sharpness of the question, the reporter asked Pratt about his religious beliefs, specifically mocking his faith in front of the assembled media. The question wasn't just a light-hearted jab. It carried a tone of ridicule. It was clear that the reporter, in his attempt to make a name for himself, hoped to provoke Pratt into a defensive response, perhaps even a moment of weakness. The room fell silent as everyone waited for Pratt's reaction. Would he shrink under the pressure, as some might expect from a celebrity used to being scrutinized by the public? Or would he rise above it, showing the world what he stood for? The world had seen Hollywood stars buckle under the weight of public mockery before, so there was certainly reason to wonder how Chris Pratt, known for his sunny disposition and good-natured humor, would handle the moment. But what happened next was nothing short of surprising. Pratt didn't flinch, and his response left everyone in the room speechless. With grace and sincerity, he took a deep breath and calmly addressed the question, not with the defensiveness many expected, but with a quiet strength that spoke volumes. His words were simple yet profound, offering a glimpse into the depth of his faith without an ounce of bitterness. Pratt spoke from a place of genuine belief, explaining how his faith was central to his life and how it gave him strength, direction, and purpose. The reporter, perhaps expecting a more combative exchange, found himself disarmed by Pratt's unwavering calmness. It wasn't just the content of his words that took everyone aback, but the way he spoke. There was no anger, no frustration, only a quiet, steady confidence that made it clear that he wasn't bothered by the mockery. In fact, he didn't seem to mind at all. His response wasn't about proving anything to the reporter or the audience. Instead, it was about standing firm in his truth. This moment wasn't just about defending his faith. It was about reminding everyone in that room that no amount of mockery could ever shake his core. As the press event wrapped up, the atmosphere in the room was charged. People left talking, but not just about the movie or the press event itself. They were discussing Chris Pratt, his faith, and his unexpected response to a moment of personal mockery. This incident wasn't just another headline about a celebrity. It was a moment of human vulnerability and strength that resonated far beyond the entertainment world. It was a reminder that sometimes, the most powerful response to criticism is not to fight back, but to rise above it with grace and dignity. In the days that followed, Pratt's response would continue to make waves. The video of the exchange went viral, sparking discussions on social media about faith, freedom of expression, and the power of standing firm in one's beliefs, no matter the cost. The story quickly became more than just about Pratt's reaction. It was a moment that encapsulated the larger cultural conversation about respect, tolerance, and the way we treat people who are different from us. Chris Pratt, in that brief moment, had unintentionally become a symbol for something much bigger. A reminder that there is power in kindness, humility, and unapologetically being yourself, even when the world seems ready to tear you down. But as the story unfolded, it became clear that the impact of that moment wouldn't be limited to just this one interaction. It would ripple out, inspiring others to stand tall in their own beliefs, whatever they might be, and to approach those with differing views not with hostility, but with understanding. This wasn't just Chris Pratt's story anymore. It had become a story for anyone who had ever faced ridicule for their convictions, a story that would continue to resonate for years to come. And as we dive deeper into this narrative, we'll explore just what made this moment so remarkable and how it changed the way people viewed Chris Pratt, not just as a Hollywood star, but as a man of unwavering principle. Chris Pratt wasn't always the confident, big-screen star that people see today. His journey from an unknown, struggling actor to a household name has been filled with ups and downs, moments of doubt, and the kind of growth that doesn't always happen overnight. Born and raised in a small town in Minnesota, Chris grew up in a family that didn't have much. His father, a small businessman, worked hard, and his mother, a teacher, was known for her kindness and unwavering support. They instilled in him the values of hard work, perseverance, and the importance of faith. But it wasn't until much later in life that Chris truly understood the power of these values, especially when they came into conflict with the celebrity world he found himself thrust into. From a young age, Chris had always been the class clown, the guy who could make people laugh even when things were tough. He wasn't the star athlete or the top student, but he had a way of drawing people in with his humor and warmth. His family was close-knit, and they supported him through everything, even when his dreams of being an actor seemed unrealistic. He worked odd jobs to make ends meet, waiting tables and delivering pizzas, all while attending auditions that felt like a never-ending cycle of rejection. But despite the setbacks, something inside him kept pushing forward. He believed in the idea that if you worked hard enough and stayed true to yourself, good things would eventually come. When Chris finally caught his big break, landing a role on Parks and Recreation, it was the opportunity he had been waiting for. But even then, it wasn't smooth sailing. The entertainment industry, with its glitz and glamour, was not as welcoming as he had imagined. It was easy to get lost in the noise, to lose sight of the values that had shaped him. The fame came quickly, but so did the pressure to conform. The world around him seemed to change almost overnight. There were the endless interviews, the media scrutinizing his every move, the expectations that he would fit into a particular mold. But through it all, Chris clung to the one thing that had always been constant in his life: his faith. Faith wasn't something that he flaunted or used as a marketing tool. It was simply a part of who he was. Growing up in a Christian household, prayer and belief had been an everyday part of his life. It was in those quiet moments before bed, in the midst of family gatherings, and during difficult times when he felt the most alone that his faith had been his anchor. But as his career took off, he found himself in situations where his beliefs were either questioned or outright mocked. It was a challenge he hadn't anticipated. The world of Hollywood, for all its glitter, often felt like a place that didn't leave room for people like him. People who didn't mind standing up for what they believed in, even if it wasn't the most popular stance. It was during these moments of doubt and challenge that he began to realize the true cost of his faith in the public eye. It wasn't just about handling the media attention or the pressure to be someone he wasn't. It was about staying true to himself in a world that constantly tried to change him. He struggled with the idea of being judged for his beliefs, of feeling like he had to defend the very thing that had always given him peace and purpose. And yet, there was a part of him that knew he couldn't change. His faith wasn't just something he believed. It was something that shaped his every decision, from the roles he chose to the way he interacted with others. But despite the criticism, Chris found support in the most unexpected places. His wife, Katherine Schwarzenegger, was a constant source of encouragement. Katherine, with her own strong sense of faith and family values, became his rock during the toughest times. She reminded him of the importance of standing tall, of living authentically, and of remembering that his faith wasn't something he needed to justify to anyone. She was the person who always believed in him, even when the world seemed determined to knock him down. Together, they navigated the pressures of Hollywood, balancing their public lives with their private beliefs. Chris also found strength in his family. His mother, especially, was a guiding force in his life. Her unwavering support and the lessons she taught him about kindness, humility, and the power of belief kept him grounded when the noise of the world threatened to drown him out. His father, who had always worked hard to provide for the family, taught him the value of perseverance and the importance of staying true to his roots. The Pratt family, although far from perfect, represented everything Chris valued: loyalty, faith, and a strong sense of community. But it wasn't just family that supported Chris through these struggles. His friends, too, played a pivotal role in helping him stay true to himself. They were the ones who reminded him that it was okay to be different, that it was okay to stand firm in his beliefs even when others didn't understand. It was in these quiet, unspoken moments with his closest friends that Chris found the strength to face the harshest criticisms. They weren't just there for the good times, the red carpets, and the accolades. They were there when things got tough, when the world seemed to turn against him for no reason other than his willingness to be himself. At this point in the story, Chris was facing a crossroads. He had achieved everything he had dreamed of, but at what cost? The fame, the fortune, the recognition. They were all things he had worked hard for, but they came with a heavy price. The more successful he became, the more he had to fight to keep his faith, his values, and his sense of self intact. The question that kept gnawing at him was simple. Could he continue to live authentically in a world that seemed determined to pull him in 1,000 different directions? His struggle wasn't just about the challenges of being a public figure or navigating a career in Hollywood. It was about something deeper, a battle between staying true to his core and giving in to the pressure to be someone he wasn't. Chris was learning the hard way that in an industry built on image and perception, the greatest challenge of all was finding a way to remain himself. But with the support of his family, friends, and his unwavering faith, he was ready to face whatever came his way. His journey wasn't just about fame or success. It was about holding on to what truly mattered. And at that moment, he was about to be tested like never before. The day Chris Pratt found himself on the receiving end of a public mocking of his faith was not just another press event. It was the start of something much larger. The challenge he faced wasn't a typical Hollywood obstacle. It was personal, cutting to the core of who he was and everything he stood for. His faith had always been a pillar in his life, something he relied on when everything else seemed uncertain. But now, in front of cameras and microphones, it felt like that very faith was being put on trial. The ridicule he faced was more than just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the growing divide between his beliefs and the prevailing cultural forces around him. At first, the question thrown at him seemed harmless enough. A casual jab, almost a joke. But it wasn't just the tone of the question that bothered him. It was the assumption that his faith was something to be mocked, something to be ridiculed in the name of progressiveness. For Chris, the challenge wasn't just about defending his belief in a higher power. It was about defending the core of his identity against a world that seemed to want to tear it down, piece by piece. In that moment, a part of Chris wanted to retreat. His first instinct was to respond with the same humor and wit that had gotten him through tough situations before. But this wasn't something that could be brushed off with a joke. This was personal. His belief system, something that had shaped his life since childhood, was now being ridiculed by someone who didn't understand it. And worse, the world seemed to be watching, ready to pass judgment on how he would react. The stakes had suddenly been raised. It wasn't just about one reporter's question. It was about everything he had worked so hard to build. The immediate aftermath of the press event was a whirlwind. News outlets picked up the exchange, dissecting every word and phrase that had been spoken. On social media, the responses were mixed. Some defended Chris, praising his composure, while others mocked him further, turning his faith into the punchline of jokes. In his mind, the question of how to handle this ridicule wasn't just about dealing with the reporter anymore. It was about confronting the larger cultural attitude toward people of faith in the public sphere. Could he continue to live authentically in an industry that seemed determined to challenge his values at every turn? The conflict wasn't just external, in the form of the ridicule he faced from the media. It was internal as well. Deep down, Chris was grappling with the fear that this moment could mark the beginning of a larger, more public rejection of his beliefs. He had worked hard to build a career that reflected his values, to be the kind of actor who could choose roles that aligned with his sense of integrity. But what if his faith, the very thing that made him who he was, became a liability? What if the more he stood up for what he believed in, the more he risked losing everything? His career, his reputation, the respect of his peers. This fear wasn't new to Chris. Throughout his career, he had often found himself caught between the desire to stay true to his beliefs and the pressure to conform to the norms of Hollywood. It was a delicate balancing act, one that required him to choose his battles carefully. But now, with the mocking of his faith in the public eye, he felt as though that balance was shifting, teetering on the edge. Could he remain steadfast in his faith and still succeed in an industry that often seemed to prioritize image over authenticity? The challenge, as it unfolded, began to feel overwhelming. In private moments, when the cameras were off and the noise of the world faded away, Chris found himself questioning everything. Was his faith strong enough to withstand the kind of public scrutiny he was now facing? Could he continue to stand firm in his beliefs, or would the constant barrage of ridicule wear him down? There were times when he felt lost, unsure of how to navigate the growing tension between his personal values and the expectations of his public life. But despite the fear and the self-doubt that threatened to overwhelm him, there was a part of Chris that refused to back down. It was the same part of him that had kept pushing through the years of rejections, the part of him that had held on to his faith through the darkest moments. In the face of this challenge, he realized that backing down wasn't an option. His faith was too important, too central to who he was. It wasn't something he could simply ignore or hide when it became inconvenient. As the days passed, the weight of the situation began to sink in. Chris knew that this was more than just a fleeting moment of media attention. This was a defining moment in his journey, one that would shape how he was seen in the eyes of the public and in his own eyes. Would he let the ridicule break him, or would he rise above it, holding on to the very thing that had made him who he was in the first place? The conflict wasn't just about defending his faith. It was about defending his right to be who he truly was, without apology. It was a battle that went beyond Hollywood, beyond the press, and into the core of his identity. In the face of this obstacle, Chris had a choice: to cower in fear of losing everything he had worked for, or to stand tall, embracing the strength that came from within. And as the days went by, it became clearer that Chris Pratt wasn't the kind of man who would back down from a challenge, no matter how difficult it seemed. He was ready to face whatever came his way, knowing that the fight wasn't just for his career, but for the values that defined him. As the days following the press event dragged on, the weight of the ridicule began to sink deeper into Chris Pratt's thoughts. On the surface, he maintained his usual, easygoing persona, charming, funny, and ever the affable Hollywood star. But inside, a storm was brewing. His belief system, which had always been an anchor in his life, was now under attack. As the criticism continued to mount, the lines between public and private life began to blur. He wasn't just fighting to protect his career or his reputation anymore. He was fighting for his very identity. In the midst of this turmoil, Chris leaned heavily on the support of those who mattered most. Catherine, his wife, became his emotional lifeline. She had always been a pillar of strength, but now, as the media storm raged on, she showed an even deeper level of care and understanding. Catherine knew exactly how much Chris's faith meant to him, and she made it clear, day after day, that she was with him every step of the way. Together, they would talk long into the night, hashing out his feelings of frustration, doubt, and fear. One evening, after reading yet another round of harsh commentary on social media, Chris let his guard down, the weight of everything finally getting to him. "I just don't know if it's worth it anymore," he admitted, his voice shaky with uncertainty. "Maybe I should just keep quiet about all of this. The media, the fans, they don't care. They just want me to fit a mold. I can't keep doing this." Catherine reached for his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Chris, don't let anyone tell you who you are. Your faith is part of you, and it's not something you have to apologize for. You've always been yourself, and that's why people love you. You can't let them change that. What's happening right now, it's not about you. It's about their own issues. Just remember why you started in this business: to tell stories, to inspire, and to live authentically." Her words were a balm for his wounded soul, but doubt lingered. The world outside, with its endless opinions and shifting expectations, felt like a relentless pressure pushing against him. As he lay there that night, trying to quiet his thoughts, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stuck between two worlds, one where he was expected to conform to the industry's norms, and the other where his faith demanded authenticity. At the same time, the tension within his professional circle began to grow. Some of his colleagues rallied behind him, offering words of support, but others, those who shared more progressive views, began to distance themselves. There were whispers behind closed doors, subtle comments during meetings that made him feel the subtle sting of judgment. One actor, a longtime colleague and friend, approached him in the studio one day after an interview where Chris had once again defended his beliefs. "I get it, man," the actor began, his voice cautious but sincere. "You've got your faith, and that's cool. But this thing you're doing, the whole defending it publicly, it's starting to make people uncomfortable. Maybe it's time to let some of this go." You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Chris, sensing the challenge in his friend's words, tried to keep his composure. He had always admired this actor, respected him for his craft and the way he carried himself. But now, in this moment, it felt like that respect was beginning to fray. "I'm not trying to prove anything," Chris replied, his voice measured but firm. "I'm just being who I am. I can't change that. I've got nothing to hide." His friend sighed, the weight of their conversation evident in the pause that followed. "It's not about hiding. It's about knowing when to be quiet, when to take a step back." Chris felt his resolve harden. Was this what Hollywood had become? A place where silence was rewarded and authenticity was a liability. He had always known that the industry wasn't always kind to people who didn't fit the mold, but this was different. This was personal. It wasn't just his career at stake. It was his sense of self. And the more his friend pushed, the more Chris felt a line being drawn between them. There was no turning back now. At home, Catherine could see the shift in Chris's demeanor. While her support never wavered, she noticed how the pressure was wearing on him. They would sit together, discussing everything from the media's portrayal of him to his growing isolation in the industry. Catherine was his sounding board, his safe space. But even she began to sense that something was shifting within him. There were moments when she'd catch him staring off into space, lost in thought, as if he were weighing the consequences of standing his ground. "I know you're frustrated," she told him one evening, her voice gentle but probing. "But you can't let their opinions define you. You're not just a product of Hollywood. You're more than that. Don't let them change who you are." Chris nodded, but the doubt gnawed at him. He couldn't help but wonder if his career would survive this. The media attention, the backlash, it was starting to take its toll. More and more, he found himself questioning whether he could continue to stand firm in his beliefs, or whether it was time to compromise, to give in and make the media storm go away. His internal battle intensified as the stakes got higher. If he continued down this path, would his career crumble? Would his public image take such a hit that he'd never be able to recover? Every interview, every public appearance, became a potential landmine. And yet, even in the face of this fear, there was something deep within him that refused to back down completely. It wasn't about the fame or the accolades. It wasn't even about the people who had started to pull away. It was about the conviction that had guided him from the very beginning. As Chris continued to navigate this challenging moment, he found his relationships with others becoming even more important. His bond with Catherine grew deeper, their partnership stronger than ever. But the tension with some of his colleagues and the mounting pressure from the public only served to harden his resolve. The more the world tried to pull him in one direction, the more determined he became to stay true to himself. And yet, the fear of losing everything still lingered, the doubt a constant shadow over every decision he made. It was clear. A turning point was approaching, and the choices he made now would shape the rest of his journey. The moment of truth arrived unexpectedly. Chris had been preparing for the fallout from the mocking of his faith. He had been bracing for another interview, another round of media scrutiny, another round of judgment. But what he hadn't anticipated was the dramatic event that would unfold at a live charity gala he was attending. The event was high-profile, bringing together influential people from the entertainment world, philanthropists, and political figures, all gathered to raise funds for a cause close to Chris's heart. For once, he was determined to keep the night focused on the mission rather than the personal attacks that had dogged him for weeks. However, as the evening unfolded, an unplanned moment would change everything. During a live-streamed segment where attendees could interact with one another, a reporter from a major outlet, who had previously mocked Chris's faith during the media storm, approached him on stage. The reporter, with a smirk barely concealed, began to ask pointed questions. "Chris, a lot of people are curious," she began, leaning into her microphone. "After all the controversy surrounding your faith and your outspoken views, do you think you're doing enough to make up for the damage? Or are you simply hoping people will forget?" The words hit Chris like a physical blow, the spotlight suddenly blinding as he stood there frozen, every eye in the room now fixed on him. The mocking tone of the reporter rang in his ears, but now there was no easy way to escape. The live stream was rolling, and the world was watching. The crowd tensed, waiting for his response, some eager for him to crumble under the pressure, others hoping for him to finally address the issue head-on. For a split second, Chris felt the weight of every doubt he had been carrying over the past few weeks. The media had been relentless, the pressure had been unyielding, and the attacks on his character had felt personal. But in that moment, something shifted within him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before stepping into the fire. His voice, when it came, was calm but resolute. "I don't think you understand," Chris said, his eyes locking with the reporters. "My faith isn't something I need to make up for. It's not a mistake or something I'm ashamed of. It's who I am, and it's what keeps me grounded. I've never once tried to impose my beliefs on anyone, but I will not apologize for being honest about who I am. If that makes some people uncomfortable, then that's their problem, not mine." The response was electric. The room, which had been holding its breath in anticipation, erupted into a wave of murmurs. Some were shocked by the directness of his words, others nodded in agreement. For a moment, it felt like the world stood still, as though Chris had just made a choice not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt pressured to hide their true selves. But the moment wasn't over. As the reporter tried to recover, pushing back with another question, Chris felt the ground beneath him shift in an unexpected direction. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw someone approach, a figure that had been absent from his life for years, but was still someone Chris admired deeply. Clint Eastwood, a legendary figure in Hollywood, made his way to the stage, his presence commanding the room. Clint had always been known for his quiet strength and unwavering principles, often walking the fine line between being a cultural icon and remaining true to his own beliefs. He had seen what was happening to Chris, and without saying a word, he stepped in to take control of the moment. "Let me say something," Clint said, his gravelly voice carrying across the room. "I've known Chris for a long time. I've seen him work hard, give back, and stand tall in a world that's constantly trying to tear you down. And I'll tell you this, he's not the problem. The problem is a world that's so caught up in tearing down anyone who dares to be different. I don't care what your faith is or where you come from. This is about integrity, about being real. And Chris? He's real." The room fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into applause. It was a pivotal moment, one that not only shifted the narrative of the evening, but also set a new course for Chris's journey. Clint's unexpected defense of him was not just an endorsement of his character. It was a public declaration of solidarity in the face of overwhelming pressure. Chris stood there, taking in the moment. The doubts, the fears, the isolation, all of it seemed to melt away. In that one moment, Clint Eastwood, a man who had lived through decades of public scrutiny, had stood beside him. It wasn't just about Hollywood. It was about something deeper, something that transcended the superficial battles they fought in front of the cameras. It was about standing up for what mattered, even when the world was watching. As the applause subsided, Chris looked back at the reporter, who had no words left. The question she had posed, meant to shame him, had backfired. He had faced her mockery head-on, and with Clint's unexpected intervention, the narrative had been rewritten. The event continued, but Chris knew that something had changed. The ridicule that had once felt like an insurmountable obstacle now seemed like a mere challenge to be faced, not something that could break him. It wasn't just Clint's support that had turned the tide. It was the power of standing firm in who he was, unapologetically. The strength he had been searching for had always been within him. And now, with the world watching, he had shown it to the world. In the weeks that followed the gala, the aftermath of Chris Pratt's dramatic confrontation with the reporter and Clint Eastwood's surprising show of support became the turning point in his career and personal life. The media storm that had initially sought to tear him down began to shift in a different direction. Rather than crumbling under the pressure, Chris found himself more solid than ever, standing firm in the face of adversity. The ridicule that had once felt overwhelming now seemed less significant in the grand scheme of things. The public's reaction was mixed at first. Some people applauded his honesty and courage, while others still criticized him. But there was a noticeable change in the tone of the conversations surrounding him. The media, sensing that the story had shifted, moved on to other narratives. Chris, however, had learned something invaluable in those moments of intense scrutiny. He had discovered not just the depth of his own convictions, but the power of remaining true to himself despite the consequences. What struck Chris most profoundly during this time was the support that poured in from unexpected places. He had always been known for his humor and charisma, but now, people saw him for more than just an actor. They saw him as a man of integrity, someone who was unafraid to stand by his beliefs even when it cost him. Fans reached out to him on social media, sharing their own struggles and how his actions had inspired them to embrace their authenticity. It was as if the whole experience had resonated far beyond the celebrity world and into the hearts of ordinary people who had once felt silenced or ashamed of their own beliefs. Catherine, too, noticed the difference in Chris. The man who had once been weighed down by uncertainty was now stronger, more confident in who he was. Their relationship, already strong, deepened even further as they shared their triumphs and challenges. She admired the way he had handled everything, not by caving in or retreating, but by embracing the discomfort and pushing through it. It was a lesson in resilience, not just for him, but for her as well. The impact of Clint Eastwood's intervention also lingered. Clint had long been a figure Chris looked up to, someone whose quiet strength had always left a lasting impression. The actor's public defense of Chris had not only given him a boost of confidence, but also reaffirmed the importance of standing together, even when the world tries to divide. In private conversations that followed, Clint encouraged Chris to keep speaking his truth, reminding him that the loudest voices are often the ones that want you to silence yours. As the months passed, Chris's career began to flourish once again. New opportunities came his way, and his role as a public figure evolved. His personal life was more balanced, and the pressures of being under a microscope seemed less daunting. He no longer felt the need to apologize for his beliefs or conform to anyone's expectations. He understood now that authenticity was his greatest asset, and no amount of criticism could take that from him. He took on new projects that reflected his values and used his platform to advocate for causes that mattered to him. He spoke openly about his faith, not in a way that demanded others to agree, but in a way that simply invited understanding. His actions and words became a source of strength for others, whether in the entertainment industry or in everyday life. But perhaps the most significant change came from within. Chris no longer felt like he was walking on eggshells, trying to appease everyone around him. He had embraced the uncertainty and discomfort that came with standing out. He realized that the opinions of others were just that, opinions. They didn't define him. His worth, his value, was not determined by the applause or condemnation of the crowd. It was rooted in something much deeper, something far more personal. During a quiet evening at home with Catherine, as they reflected on how far they had come, Chris smiled to himself. The road had been long, and the journey wasn't over, but he had learned something that would stay with him forever. "You know," he said to her, "I think we can be afraid of standing up for ourselves. We don't want to rock the boat, upset people. But sometimes, you just have to stand up for what's right, even when no one's watching. Even when you think you're standing alone." Catherine smiled, squeezing his hand. "I've always known you had that in you." And it was true. Through all the ridicule, all the doubts, Chris had emerged stronger, more grounded in who he was than ever before. He had faced the obstacles, both external and internal, and had come out the other side with a deeper understanding of himself and his purpose. He knew now that there would always be challenges, always be critics, but that didn't mean he had to let them shape him. He had the power to shape his own narrative, to live authentically. The final message was clear. Life is not about fitting into someone else's mold. It's about embracing who you are, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when the world tells you to change. It's about standing firm in your truth, no matter the consequences, and finding strength in the support of those who truly matter. For Chris Pratt, the journey was far from over, but he had found peace in knowing that his authenticity would always be his greatest source of strength. And so, the story ended, not with a neat conclusion, but with a sense of ongoing growth and transformation. It wasn't about the applause or the accolades. It was about the quiet confidence of knowing who you are and having the courage to share it with the world. And in that, Chris had found his true victory.